Good evening. This is going to be a very interesting month. We have three fascinating phenomena, all visible from here, clouds permitting. We have a transit of Mercury, a total eclipse of the moon, and an annular eclipse of the sun. So let's begin with the transit of Mercury. That comes first at dawn on May the 7th. Now Mercury is the innermost planet. On average only 36 million miles from the sun, so never very prominent. It's been bypassed by one probe, Mariner 10, and here's a picture from Mariner 10 showing Mercury as a mountainous crater world not too unlike the moon. Now, because Mercury is so much closer in than we are, it can pass in transit across the face of the sun, and it does so, it looks like a small black spot. And that's what's going to happen on May the 7th. I'm afraid you won't see that with the naked eye. Mercury is small. You've got to use the telescope, but beware. We'll come to that later on. Meanwhile, in past years, transits were regarded as very important. At this stage, I'm delighted to welcome back one of our regular visitors, Dr. Allan Chapman. Allan, welcome back.
Good evening, Patrick. It's a great delight and a pleasure to be with you again.
Have you ever seen the transit of Mercury?
I have indeed, the one of 1970. I think it was the 9th of May 1970, and I observed it from Lancaster. And curious enough, in many ways, it was rather like the present transit because it really was on the sun as the sun came up. And I remember tracing it across the sun's disk as a tiny little spot, taking some photographs of it which were not terribly good, but nonetheless following the course of the transit.
I must say, you're luckier than I am. I've been counted out every time. I have yet to see a transit of Mercury.
And I have yet to see a solar eclipse.
Well, now, what telescope did you use?
I used the device behind us here. It's a small aperture instrument of about 2 inches, 36 inches focal length with a black box on the end and a projection screen which can either take a photographic slide or alternatively, of course, one can just have a prime focus image and follow the sun across.
Because one thing not to do is to look direct at the sun.
Never at all.
Transit observations go back a long way, don't they?
Indeed. The very first realization that Mercury might pass across the face of the sun took place with Johannes Kepler as early as 1627. And from his famous Rudolphine tables, which of course he developed from the observations of Tycho Brahe, he realized that it was possible for Mercury and Venus to transit the sun. Now, in 1629, he issued a little pamphlet predicting that there will be a transit of Mercury and a transit of Venus both in the same year, 1631.
Then, of course, we come then to Edmund Halley.
Edmund Halley, of course, in the 17th century, he was crucial as well, because he observed that in 1677. He was in St. Helena, and he made an observation of it, and then it occurred to him. He was observing this transit more southerly in the world than anyone had ever seen it before. And he realized there must be people in Europe making observations as well, especially in Paris and in England. And he realized that if you could measure the distance between St. Helena and, let's say, a major European observatory, and notice the time differences between the two places where it had been observed and the slightly different positions of Mercury on the solar surface, you could use that to calculate the distance of the sun. Now, this was, of course, crucial to laying out the dimensions of the solar system. And whilst he realized at the time that Mercury was too tiny and its motion was too quick to really make this calculation possible, he did realize that Venus would do it in 1761 and 69. And it's one of those great realizations in the history of astronomy, where a man realizes, I'll never see this great future phenomena, but if we observe it carefully, in 80-odd years' time, we can find the distance of the sun to a new and unrivaled level.
Well, I mean, no one living now who has actually seen one. The last one was in 1882, but
it was indeed.
We are going to have one next year.
We will have one next year, and then, of course, one 12 years after.
Indeed. Now, what are you going to look for with this transit?
Well, in time with the Mercury transit, to really observe the beauty of it. There's relatively little that we can get out of it in terms of an amateur level of serious scientific data, but it's a beautiful event. And of course, most people, as you say, have never seen Mercury. It's too tiny, it's too dim to the naked eye unless you're under ideal conditions. But in transit, you can see it as a little tiny speck of maybe 7 or 8 arc seconds in diameter.
Also, it's going to be darker than any sunspots on view.
Absolutely jet black. And when you see sunspots, of course, we always think of sunspots as dark, but when you see them against Mercury, or next year against Venus, the absolute coal blackness of the planet really becomes immediately obvious. And also, it will be a perfect ball. Look at sunspots carefully under high magnification, and they break down into all irregular shapes. Mercury will be an absolute perfect little ping-pong ball, bang on the solar surface.
Let's imagine the sun has risen, Mercury's in transit, and the sky is clear. how would we use a telescope to observe it? This little telescope will do very well. The thing not to do is to take a dark cap, put it over the eyepiece, and look direct. Never look straight at the sun through any telescope, even with a dark filter like that. Thing to do, point your telescope at the sun without looking through it, and then hold the card behind the eyepiece there, and you see an image will be projected, and you'll see Mercury. The sun is dangerous, and one quick look would be one too many. Nevertheless, there are ways and means, and delighted to welcome back again our photographic expert, Douglas Arnold.
Thank you, Patrick.
Douglas, there are ways of using filters.
Yes, indeed, Patrick. As in most things, there are relatively low-cost instruments and more expensive instruments. The sort of safe filtration material which you can get is very thin plastic, which has to be carefully positioned over the front of the telescope.
What's it called?
This is called Bader film, but there are various types which you can get, relatively modestly priced. This can be fitted with an elastic band, for example, carefully at the front of a telescope. More expensive filters, which the keener amateurs will have, are glass filters, which, all things being equal, will tend to give a higher quality product. But they're all equally as safe.
But these go over the
front, the object, never at the other end,
no.
never at the other end. Now, the interesting thing about this transit, Patrick, is that it begins quite early in the morning, so that one of the things, if anybody is out early, they will have to make sure they've got a pretty clear east-northeast horizon. It will climb as the transit goes on, and by mid-morning it will be really getting quite high. So if you're wanting to get out early, the number one requirement is have a clear horizon. Now, I've done a number of transits, and the thing which impresses me about them is that Mercury is so small compared with the Sun that you do need considerable magnification. Now, here are some pictures which I took in Australia in 1993. You have to move to eyepiece projection to get a really good, clear, impressive image of Mercury transiting the Sun.
Now let's turn to the total eclipse of the moon due on May the 16th. The Earth casts a shadow in space. If the moon passes into that shadow, the supply of sunlight's cut off, and the moon turns a dim, very often coppery colour, when it's inside the shadow. It doesn't usually vanish completely. A certain amount of sunlight is bent onto it by way of the shell of air around the Earth, but certainly the eclipse is very noticeable. But of course, not all eclipses are alike, Alan.
Oh no, they vary greatly. And sometimes you can have literally a total eclipse of the moon where the entire moon vanishes, or as in our present case, of course, a more partial one. Now, over the centuries, these have been noticed to be all kinds of different colours. As you say, they're normally a coppery or a yellow colour. But if there's, let's say, a great deal of natural pollution taking place, such as a volcanic eruption, then you can have them turning bright red. And in the period before we knew much about other continents in the world's surface, and we didn't know if there'd been a great explosion or volcanic eruption in Polynesia or North America or somewhere like that. We had all sorts of reports about peculiar colours. Nowadays, of course, we use a thing called the Danjon scale for measuring the different light changes in a lunar eclipse. But also, eclipses were used for determining the moon's distance, and Hipparchus in the 2nd century BC had the bright idea that if you could time the period that it took the moon to pass through the Earth's shadow in an eclipse, you could calculate its distance using geometry. And he came to the conclusion that the Earth and the moon were 67 1/3 Earth radii apart, and that's astonishingly good. And he got that from partial eclipses of the moon in the 2nd century BC.
There are some lovely stories about past eclipses, including one involving Christopher Columbus.
There was indeed. In 1504, Columbus, on what I think was his 3rd expedition to the New World, was besieged by natives in Jamaica. And he was in considerable danger of his life, and they were probably likely to do him some mischief. Now, very fortunately, he had with him a copy of Regiomontanus's almanac called Calendarium, the calendar, and it predicted that in a few days' time there would be an eclipse of the moon. And so what he did is to tell the people who were besieging him that in a few days' time he would make the moon go dark if they didn't lay off their siege. And of course he didn't pay any attention to this, but lo and behold, the moon went dark. And when it went dark, Columbus got out in one piece. A very useful application of astronomy.
Very good indeed. Well, here's a picture I took of an eclipse some years ago, fairly bright there. Now, this time, we should have a good view. Timetable, the moon starts going into the shadow at 3:13 summertime. Totality begins at 4:14 and lasts till 5:06, and the entire eclipse ends after 6 o'clock, by which time the moon's pretty low. Of course, photographing the lunar eclipse requires a very different technique. So Douglas, what about the eclipse?
Well, it's interesting, Patrick, in that we've been worrying with the transit about the clear northeast horizon.
Yes.
With this lunar eclipse, of course, we're going to be losing the end of it to the dawn and also to the west-northwest horizon. So the thing is that particularly if people are interested in trying to get totality, they have to have a completely clear west-northwest horizon. Now, so far as exposures are concerned, it's really rather difficult to give comprehensive advice, but most people would be using, with a typical long lens or a telescope, they would be tending to use relatively fast film, say 400 ISO or 800 ISO, and the longer focal length is possible, the better, of course. And typically, if we're talking about totality here, not the partial phases, if you were on a fast negative film, most people will be using negative film, the latitude is higher, you would be shooting at typically something like 1/4 of a second, 1/2 of a second onto a second, but bracketing, that's important.
Yes, yes.
By bracketing we mean, look, don't just take one shot at one exposure. If you think you should be exposing at a second or
Yes.
a couple of seconds at the aperture you're using, then bracket 3 or 4 stops either side, and 1 or 2 of them are going to be good. But the important thing here is you'll have to move quickly because that moon will be plummeting to the horizon.
What about digital cameras?
No particular problem, Patrick, except you suffer from noise with digital cameras when using high-speed equivalents, and noise is really a killer, so that you can use them, and if it's the only camera you've got, what have you got to lose by using them? But by rating at high speeds with digital cameras, they have many advantages, but you do risk getting noise which you don't get with film.
And now let's come to the main event of the month, the annular eclipse of the sun, due on May the 31st, visible from North Scotland and Iceland. An eclipse of the sun is caused when the moon passes in front of the sun and blots it out for a few minutes. And a total eclipse, the effect is lovely. Here's one I saw in the Caribbean some years ago, the sun's corona. Now, this one, I fear, won't be total, it'll be annular. The moon is furthest from the earth and doesn't quite cover the sun, but all the same, it's worth seeing. And of course, our stories here too. And once again, we come back, don't we, to Edmund Halley.
Edmund Halley was, of course, one of the first people to really popularize eclipses. But even before him, the Greeks had tried to model the solar system and explain why sometimes in an eclipse an entire sun, as you say, was blotted out, but on other occasions there was always this ring around it. And Claudius Ptolemy had suggested in the 2nd century AD that this was because there were epicycles, eccentric circles, on which the planets moved. And sometimes the moon was slightly further away than at other times. And hence, of course, you could sometimes have a totally blotted out sun, and other times the moon was just a little bit too far away, and you always left a ring of fire. But it was Edmund Halley who first popularized eclipses. Now, of course, as you so splendidly do, is to arouse people's attentions to study the heavens. Edmund Halley, I might suggest, was one of your intellectual ancestors, one of the first people to do that. And he did this with the famous eclipse of 1715, which wasn't an annular, but the first one that was seen in southern Britain for 600 years. And what Halley did in advance was to publish this extraordinary list, a picture, of course, of the British Isles, and on there is a picture of the shadow. It goes more or less over the Isle of Wight totality at the bottom to more or less North Wales at the top, and the centre of totality goes bang across Britain. And he issued this list for all people who owned moderate telescopes and clocks to make observations of it, partly because, of course, it would be a wonderful event for them to see, but more importantly, he asked them to send their results back to him. And he got all sorts of people sending in the results so he could correct the motion of the moon. All kinds of people, including on the one hand the Bishop of Exeter, and on the other hand a tax collector in Northamptonshire. And literally this was an eclipse that crossed the entire population. Now, from that time onwards, people have been fascinated in studying eclipses in a popular context. And on the one hand, yes, there's this wonderful, glorious sight that we see. But on the other hand, well-informed amateurs with modest equipment can still collect wonderful information and send it to scientific authorities. Nowadays, of course, they're not just observing its timings like Halley was concerned with. They're observing flash spectra. They're observing the position of the corona and things of this kind. But all of these things are now being done by amateurs all across the world.
Well, in my lifetime, there have been 2 English total solar eclipses, one in 1927, which I didn't see, I was too young, and the other, of course, 11th of August, 1999, and we were the Sky Night were in Falmouth, sitting under umbrellas, listening to the rain and saying, tut, tut, dear me, how annoyed, but at least there's going to be another one in the year 2090. Meanwhile, we do have this annular eclipse, although not so spectacular, it's going to be well worth seeing, and we're going to North Scotland. So, Douglas, will you give us some tips, please?
So far as the United Kingdom is concerned, the sun is already eclipsing when it comes up. It will be looking quite different in different parts of the United Kingdom. Now, we've got some examples here, you see. In Stornoway in the Scottish Islands, we do have annularity. In Edinburgh, we have slightly less. It's not annular. We're losing the top of the annularity. It's a very attractive looking horseshoe almost of the annular. Now, down to Newcastle, there's less of the annularity. We're seeing more of the sun. Down to London, we're approximately about 50%. In Cardiff, we're possibly perhaps about a third of the disk is occluded, and way off in the southwest in Penzance, you've just about got a partial eclipse. Now, I think the thing that one needs to emphasize about this, Patrick, is that while you will get considerable variations early in the morning in particular, is that it's easy to give estimates of f-stops and shutter speeds, but what people should be doing will be in advance of May the 31st, as far as they can, to go out where they have a clear east-northeast horizon and practice. It won't be the same as being there and doing it on the day. Conditions may vary, but it will give them an extremely good impression of what the sun will be looking like through the filters that we've been emphasizing. And again, when people are running those practices, they should bracket again.
There's one more thing I think we ought to make quite clear. When the sun is very low down or partially clouded, it looks very harmless. Mm-hmm. And it isn't. The sun is always dangerous.
Yes.
Treated with great respect.
Very great respect, always.
Let's only hope for clear skies. If you'd like more information about where to go to see the eclipse, then contact the Highlands Tourist Board. Their website is highlandsfreedom.com. And of course, all on our own website, www.bbc.co.uk/space. And our CFAX number is 620. And when I come back next month, we will be reporting on all these events, and also talking about gamma ray bursts. Until then.